I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are building the largest, most complex, and undeniably most expensive machine on the face of the earth.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
A massive undertaking.
Right. You spend years pouring millions of cubic yards of concrete, moving literal mountains of earth, diverting the very forces of nature itself.
Yeah.
And finally, the day comes, you flip the switch, the machine roars to life. It is a complete engineering triumph.
It's a total marvel.
It is. But it's at that exact moment you look around and realize you have absolutely no customers for what it produces.
Which is just wild to think about. I mean, it is the ultimate test of, if you build it, will they actually come?
Exactly.
And they executed this test on a scale that fundamentally altered the geography of the American West.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are looking at a deeply researched historical dossier covering the massive damming of the Columbia and Klamath rivers.
And our mission for this conversation is very specific, isn't it?
It really is. We are going to follow the money. We're answering a seemingly simple question. When the West dammed its wild rivers, who actually profited? And, who paid the invisible bill?
And approaching this requires a really measured documentary lens. We aren't here to paint cartoon villains or prosecute the past.
Right.
The history we are analyzing here, it involves the creation of a real industrial economy, the building of actual towns, and the securing of vital national defense during a global crisis.
Yeah, real stakes.
Exactly. But all of those celebrated achievements were built on an operating cost that was completely left off the official ledger.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the starting point of the story is a fascinating economic paradox.
It really is.
We're in 1937. The BPA, the Bonneville Power Administration, is sitting on this staggering amount of federal hydroelectric power.
Generated by the newly authorized Bonneville and Grand Coulee dams.
Right, but the Pacific Northwest in the late 1930s doesn't have a massive population center. There is no sprawling, electrified metropolis of millions ready to absorb that kind of load.
No, not at all.
And the BPA has to sell this power to justify the massive congressional appropriations used to build the dams. But, there is no local market. They desperately need a bulk customer that can just drink electricity by the oceanful.
And, aluminum was really the only industry on Earth that fit that profile?
Because of the energy it takes to make it, right?
Yeah. For an aluminum smelter, raw materials like bauxite, those are almost secondary concerns compared to the sheer volume of energy required.
It's all about the power.
It is. Electricity is the absolute ultimate bottleneck. It's the single largest input cost by a massive, massive margin.
Which makes sense. To understand why aluminum was the perfect match for a massive dam, you have to conceptualize how it's actually made.
Right. It's not like forging iron.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
I like to think of the Hall-Héroult smelting process not as traditional metalworking, but, as capturing lightning in a bottle.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
You aren't just melting rock in a furnace. You're taking alumina, dissolving it in a bath of molten cryolite.
Which lowers the melting point, so you don't need impossible temperatures.
Right, and then you blast an astonishing amount of steady electrical current directly through the chemical bonds to separate the metal.
It's intense.
It really is. The math in our sources is staggering. It takes 13,000 to 16,000 kilowatt hours to produce a single metric ton of primary aluminum.
Which, just for context, that energy intensity is an incredible outlier. Producing a ton of aluminum requires roughly 10 times the amount of electricity it takes to manufacture a ton of steel.
Wow, 10 times.
Or glass, or paper, yeah. And furthermore, that power can never fluctuate.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if a smelter loses power, even briefly, the molten cryolite bath literally freezes solid in the pots.
Oh, no.
It effectively destroys the entire facility. So they needed massive, uninterrupted baseload power. And in 1939, the absolute cheapest, most reliable electricity available anywhere on the globe was spilling out of the Columbia River.
Since power is the ultimate bottleneck, did the aluminum industry just pack up and chase the rivers?
They absolutely did. The industry naturally chased the cheapest megawatt on the map. On December 20, 1939, the BPA signs its very first major power contract.
With ALCOA, right?
Yes. ALCOA agrees to buy an enormous block of power for a massive 218-acre smelter right near Vancouver, Washington.
So they bought up the excess.
Basically, yeah. ALCOA essentially bought the majority of the power the BPA had to sell that year. The dam finally had its customer, and the modern industrial Pacific Northwest was officially born.
And the timing of that is just incredible.
It really dictated the geopolitical future of the country. By pulling aluminum production into the Pacific Northwest in 1939 and 1940, the region was perfectly positioned for the outbreak of World War II.
Almost overnight, the Columbia River Basin became the physical backbone of the American Air War.
Yeah, the Defense Plant Corporation kicks off this breathtaking ramp-up. We go from that single ALCOA plant in 1940 to an absolute explosion of industrial capacity.
You have Reynolds Metals building a massive smelter at Longview. You have Henry J. Kaiser moving in to leverage the cheap grid.
And by 1950, Washington state alone is producing roughly half of all the aluminum in the United States.
Half. That is wild. The logistics of this are just incredible to visualize. You have alumina being shipped in by rail.
Liquefied and electrified by the power of the Columbia River.
Yeah, rolled into sheets and then transported just a few hours north to Boeing's Seattle plants in unheard of quantities.
And those sheets became the B-17 bombers that filled the skies over Europe.
Kaiser used that exact same industrial grid capacity to launch roughly 1,500 Liberty and Victory ships.
The federal estimates later showed something amazing. The power generated by the Grand Coulee Dam alone smelted the aluminum for about a third of all the aircraft built by the U.S. during the entire war.
I want to firmly ground us in the historical reality of that moment, though, because it is very easy for you or me, sitting here today with our modern sensibilities, to look back at the damming of these rivers as an ecological crime.
Sure, it's easy to judge in hindsight.
Exactly. But these men weren't trying to destroy rivers. They were patriots fighting a global war against fascism. To them, a wild river running to the sea was wasted power that could be turned into fighting metal.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, President Truman himself later credited the power of the Columbia River dams as being nearly indispensable to the Allied victory.
Right.
In the context of 1941, cheap power was not just an economic tool. It was an incredibly potent, tangible national asset. It was the physical manifestation of the arsenal of democracy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because as visible as the bomber planes and the battleships were, the sheer, unimaginable power output of these dams made them the only viable candidate for something completely hidden.
Oh, yes.
The most secretive military project in human history was looking for a home, and the Columbia River was the only place that could support it.
We're talking about the Manhattan Project. They needed a location to manufacture plutonium in 1942.
And they selected the Hanford site.
Right, in south-central Washington state, about 90 miles north of the Grand Coulee Dam. And the site selection wasn't arbitrary at all. It was entirely dictated by the river.
Because the physical requirements to synthesize plutonium at that scale are just intense.
Unbelievably intense.
Extreme isolation from major populations was obvious, in case something went catastrophically wrong with a reactor. But the proximity to the Columbia wasn't just for electricity, was it? It was a thermal necessity.
It was. Producing weapons-grade plutonium generates an immense, staggering amount of thermal energy. A standard industrial cooling system was wildly insufficient for this.
So they needed the river.
They needed the raw, icy, high-volume flow of the Columbia River to be pumped directly through the reactor cores, just to prevent a catastrophic nuclear meltdown.
Wow.
And to run those massive pumps without a single second of interruption, they needed the most reliable, high-volume baseload hydropower on Earth, which they drew straight from the turbines of Grand Coulee and Bonneville.
So the very flow of a wild, ancient river was directly physically chained to the dawn of the atomic age.
It really was.
From 1943 onward, the electricity from those dams ran Hanford's reactors and its chemical separation plants in total, absolute secrecy.
Yep.
And the plutonium that was produced there, using that river's power and cooling water, that fueled the Trinity test in July 1945 and ultimately the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki.
The line from the snowmelt in the Cascade Mountains to the end of the Second World War ran straight through the turbine halls of the Columbia River.
It's just wild to think about. So the dams were minting electricity to fight the war, but they were also fundamentally replumbing the entire landscape of the West to create cheap water.
Oh, absolutely.
While the BPA was managing the power grid, the Bureau of Reclamation was operating like an engineer with a god complex, wiring the sky with one hand and replumbing the earth with the other.
Turning what they saw as barren waste into an agricultural empire. The geographic terraforming they executed is just hard to overstate.
Like down on the Klamath Project.
Yeah, which started back in 1905. They systematically drained huge portions of the lower Klamath and Tule Lakes. They carved out roughly 185 miles of main canals.
That's a massive scale.
It is, converting 225,000 acres of marsh and rangeland into hyper-productive irrigated farmland.
And on the Columbia, the mechanics of the Columbia Basin Project are just mind-bending.
Mm.
When first water flowed in May 1952, they weren't just letting gravity do the work.
No, they had to fight gravity.
They used Grand Coulee's massive off-peak nighttime power to run giant reverse turbines, literally pushing millions of gallons of river water straight uphill into an ancient dry riverbed to create Banks Lake.
It was a closed-loop engineering marvel designed specifically to irrigate another 670,000 acres of land.
And to the engineers and the farmers settling that land, the arithmetic was self-evidently good. They looked at a wetland and said, this produces nothing.
Right. They drained it, brought in controlled irrigation, and suddenly it produced high-yield crops. It supported families. It built entire regional economies.
But while the federal government was using these dams to win wars and irrigate empires on the Columbia, private industry was watching.
Oh, they definitely were.
Down on the Klamath, we see the exact same engineering, but entirely stripped of the national security justification.
Yeah, we're talking about the California Oregon Power Company, or QCO.
Which later becomes PacifiCorp. Right.
Exactly. They built a chain of dams on the Klamath River across the California-Oregon border. You had Copco number 1 by 1922, Copco number 2, and eventually the Iron Gate Dam in 1962.
Wait, so while the Columbia dams were built under the banner of national security and public works, the Klamath dams were just straightforward corporate profit engines blocking a major river.
That's exactly what they were. The electricity generated there was strictly investor-owned. A private utility built massive concrete walls across one of the greatest salmon rivers in the American West, entirely to generate private revenue.
Which brings us to the true cost of all of this. Because we've followed the money, we've traced the current from the massive turbines to the aluminum smelters.
To the Boeing bombers,
Yeah.
to the Hanford plutonium reactors.
Yeah, to the sprawling green farms, and finally to the private utility shareholders. But everything they built, every bomber, every farm, every dividend, it was artificially cheap.
Because of a textbook economic externality? The invisible subsidy of the American West.
Right.
These incredible, celebrated enterprises, ALCOA, Boeing, the massive corporate farms, the utilities, they rigorously priced all of their inputs. They knew exactly what bauxite cost down to the cent.
They priced the labor, the capital, the steel.
And the millions of yards of concrete.
Yep.
But they did not price the salmon.
And the physical devastation to the ecosystem was absolute. I mean, when they built the Grand Coulee Dam, they built a sheer concrete face over 500 feet tall with absolutely no fish ladders.
None.
In a single stroke, they permanently severed over 1,000 miles of prime, pristine, upstream salmon habitat.
And down on the Klamath, those private KPCO dams completely choked off the upper river from the sea. The fish literally could not return to their spawning grounds.
And we have to name the specific people who actually paid the bill for that loss.
Because it wasn't the people buying the cheap electricity or the subsidized water?
No. The absent party, the people who actively subsidized this entire regional economy, were the native nations.
For millennia, their economies, their cultures, and their very physical survival depended entirely on the reliability of those salmon runs.
On the Columbia, you have the Yakima, the Umatilla, the Nez Perce, and the Warm Springs tribes.
And on the Klamath, it's the Klamath, the Yurok, the Karuk, and the Hoopa Valley tribes.
This wasn't just a moral or cultural tragedy. It was the targeted destruction of a sovereign legal economy.
Yes, that's a crucial point. These tribes possessed treaty-secured fisheries, legal rights explicitly promised by the United States government in writing during the 1850s.
They reserved the right to fish in their usual and accustomed places. And the dams effectively rendered those treaties economically null by destroying the underlying resource.
The tribes financed the cheapness of the modern Northwest. Their food source, their primary economic engine, and their cultural keystone were systematically erased to lower the overhead costs for the aluminum plants and the irrigators.
And they were never asked for their resources.
Nor were they ever compensated for the subsidy they provided.
It's like building a wildly successful, legally celebrated enterprise, but secretly putting the massive operating costs on your neighbor's credit card without them knowing.
That is exactly what happened.
And you never, ever pay them back. The Pacific Northwest we know today was built on their credit.
It was.
So what does this all mean? When we look back at this incredible sweep of history, the engineering, the war, the farms, the profits, and the profound silent loss, how do we actually evaluate it?
Well, the historical dossier asks us to evaluate this through a specific continuum: ignorance, indifference, and greed.
Okay.
It actively refuses to give us an easy, sweeping verdict. It forces you to weigh the different actors on this stage.
Because they aren't all the same.
Right. If you analyze the wartime aluminum rush or the frantic race to manufacture plutonium at Hanford in the 1940s, that era was heavily driven by genuine urgency and sheer ignorance.
Right, in the middle of a world war with the fate of the globe hanging in the balance.
Exactly. Very few people in power were stopping to weigh the life cycle of a salmon against fighting fascism.
The priority was sheer survival. They were moving at breakneck speed, utilizing the resources they had to ensure an Allied victory.
But as you move along the timeline, the scale begins to slide.
Toward the Klamath dams, for instance.
Yes. When you look at decades of deliberate for-profit operation of the Klamath dams by a private utility, operating those massive concrete barriers long after the ecological and cultural devastation was deeply, undeniably understood.
The scale slides firmly away from ignorance.
It moves deeply into indifference and ultimately into corporate greed. Those private dams were kept in place, making money for shareholders, right up until they were finally forced to be removed in 2024. The truth is that different beneficiaries of this cheap power sit at very different points on that continuum.
It's a deeply complex legacy. We built a machine that fundamentally changed the world, but the fuel it ran on was someone else's livelihood.
This raises an important question, and it's one we have to ask ourselves as we look forward, not just backward.
What's that?
Right now, we are rushing to build the massive new green power infrastructures of tomorrow. We are rapidly building wind farms, vast solar arrays, and thousands of miles of new transmission lines.
All to save our current environment from climate change.
Exactly. As we aggressively build that new world, what invisible subsidies, what modern salmon runs are we quietly leaving off our ledgers today?
That is a profound question to walk away with. What is the hidden cost of our next great machine? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.